There are conversations that society avoids not because they are false, but because they are uncomfortable. There are truths that sit quietly in the background of everyday life, shaping outcomes, shaping people, shaping generations, while no one wants to name them out loud. Today, we are going to talk about one of those truths, a pattern that starts early, follows boys into adulthood, and quietly explains a great deal about what we are witnessing right now. Stay with me until the very end, because what we are discussing today connects family dynamics, modern culture, and the choices men are making in ways most people never stop to examine. Before we begin, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. Your support helps this channel continue to grow and reach people who need to hear these conversations. Also, if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. The Academy is linked in the description of this video, and it teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly with a long term mindset. Go check it out now if you are serious about taking control of your financial future instead of leaving it in the hands of systems that do not care about you. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support directly, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description of the video. Every bit of support helps keep this channel independent and focused on saying what needs to be said. Now, let us begin. To understand what is happening to men in society today, you have to rewind the tape far earlier than most people are willing to look. You have to go back before dating, before careers, before relationships, before politics, and even before culture. You have to look at the earliest environment where a boy learns who he is allowed to be and what his value is supposed to be. That environment is the family, and more specifically, the dynamic between a mother and her son. This is not about blaming all mothers, and it is not about denying that many mothers do their best under difficult circumstances. This is about identifying a recurring pattern that exists often enough to shape entire generations of men and influence how they later navigate the world. In certain family systems, especially those driven by insecurity, unresolved emotional wounds, and the need for control, sons are not raised to become independent, confident adults. They are shaped instead to remain emotionally dependent, unsure of themselves, and hesitant to trust their own judgment. This does not happen by accident. It happens through subtle behaviors repeated over years, through messages that contradict one another, and through a slow erosion of a boy's sense of self. The result is not always obvious in childhood, but it becomes painfully clear in adulthood. In these family systems, sons are often assigned roles rather than being allowed to develop naturally. These roles serve the emotional needs of the parent rather than the developmental needs of the child. The first role is the golden child, the son who is praised, elevated, and showcased not for who he truly is, but for how well he reflects on the parent. This son learns early that love is conditional. Approval is given when he performs correctly, thinks correctly, and behaves in ways that align with the parent's image. His success does not belong to him, it belongs to the parent. Over time, he learns that being himself is less important than maintaining approval. And this creates a deep internal conflict that follows him into adulthood. The second role is the forgotten child. This son receives minimal attention, not because he is disliked, but because he is emotionally convenient to ignore. He learns to survive by staying out of the way, by not asking for much, and by becoming self sufficient early. While this may appear to give him freedom, it also deprives him of guidance, affirmation, and emotional security. He learns independence without support, resilience without reassurance. He is often the least visibly damaged, but that does not mean he is untouched. He carries a quiet sense of being unseen, and that can shape how he forms connections later in life. The third role is the scapegoat, and this is where the deepest damage occurs. The scapegoat son becomes the emotional dumping ground for everything the parent cannot face within themselves. Feelings of shame, insecurity, frustration, and dissatisfaction are projected outward and placed onto the child. He is treated as if he is the problem, even when he has done nothing wrong. His emotions are dismissed. His intentions are questioned. His very existence becomes a source of tension within the household. Over time, he internalizes the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with him. What makes this especially destructive is that these roles are not static labels, they shape how a boy experiences reality. A scapegoated son grows up doubting his perceptions, second guessing his instincts, and feeling a constant need to explain himself. He becomes hyper aware of others' emotions while losing touch with his own. He learns that standing up for himself leads to punishment, withdrawal, or ridicule. This creates a man who is vulnerable to manipulation later in life, not because he is weak, but because he was trained to prioritize others' comfort over his own well being. As these boys grow into men, they carry these early lessons with them into relationships, workplaces, and society at large. The patterns repeat because they feel familiar. A man who grew up having his needs minimized may find himself drawn to relationships where his needs are again secondary. A man who was taught that love is conditional may tolerate disrespect in exchange for approval. A man who was blamed for problems he did not create may accept guilt for situations that are not his responsibility. This is not coincidence, it is conditioning. When these men encounter broader cultural messages that reinforce the idea that they are inherently flawed, unnecessary, or burdensome, it does not feel foreign. It feels familiar. It echoes the environment they grew up in. When society tells men to sit down, be quiet, and question their own instincts, many of them recognize that voice. They have heard it before. They heard it at home. This is why so many men absorb these messages silently rather than openly rejecting them. They were taught early that resistance leads to consequences. Over the past several decades, cultural narratives have increasingly framed men and boys as problems to be managed rather than individuals to be developed. Masculine traits that once helped men navigate responsibility, risk, and leadership have been rebranded as flaws. Boys are often corrected more than they are encouraged. Their energy is treated as disruption rather than potential. Their questions are framed as challenges rather than curiosity. Over time, this creates confusion. Men are told they are not needed, not wanted, and not valued, while simultaneously being expected to show up when things become difficult. This contradiction creates exhaustion. Men are asked to disengage while also being blamed for disengaging. They are told to step aside while being criticized for their absence. They are told that independence is selfish while dependency is mocked. This emotional whiplash mirrors the early family dynamics many men experienced, where expectations were unclear and approval was inconsistent. Eventually, many men reach a breaking point where they stop trying to reconcile contradictions that were never meant to be resolved. At that point, something shifts. Men begin to withdraw not out of bitterness, but out of self preservation. They stop participating in systems that consistently drain them while offering little in return. They stop seeking validation from environments that have made it clear that their presence is conditional. This withdrawal is not dramatic, it is quiet. It looks like fewer conversations, fewer commitments, fewer emotional investments. It looks like men choosing peace over approval. This is what people misunderstand when they talk about men walking away. It is not about anger. It is not about revenge. It is about clarity. Men are recognizing patterns and choosing to step out of them. They are realizing that being alone is not the same as feeling alone. Many men discover that once the noise fades, once the expectations drop, hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Once the constant need to explain themselves disappears, they experience something unfamiliar but deeply grounding. They experience calm. Men are by nature adaptable and practical. When they see that certain environments consistently produce stress, conflict, and instability, they adjust. They simplify. They focus on what brings tangible value to their lives. This often means reducing obligations that do not align with their goals, limiting exposure to constant criticism, and redirecting energy toward personal growth, financial stability, and health. This is not escapism, it is prioritization. What is particularly revealing is how quickly narratives shift when men actually do step back. After years of being told they are not needed, men are suddenly asked where they went. After being criticized for their presence, their absence becomes a problem. This reaction exposes the underlying reality. The issue was never that men were unnecessary. The issue was that men were expected to exist in a state of constant self sacrifice without acknowledgement or reciprocity. As economic pressures increase, and daily life becomes more demanding, the absence of men's contribution becomes more noticeable. Responsibilities that were once shared or buffered are now felt more directly, but the same systems that encourage men to disengage now struggle under the weight of that disengagement. This is not punishment, it is consequence. Men did not create this outcome intentionally. They responded logically to the incentives and messages presented to them. For many men, walking away has meant reclaiming agency over their time, money, and emotional energy. They are no longer willing to invest in dynamics that replicate the instability of their early family experiences. They are learning to trust observable reality rather than promises. They are paying attention to patterns rather than words. This shift is subtle but powerful, and it represents a fundamental change in how men relate to the world around them. And this is especially true for men who grew up as scapegoats. For them, walking away is often the first time they have chosen themselves without guilt. It is the first time they have recognized that they are not responsible for fixing everyone else's dissatisfaction. It is the first time they have allowed themselves to exist without constant justification. That realization can feel both liberating and unsettling because it requires unlearning patterns that once felt necessary for survival. As men settle into this new way of living, many discover that simplicity is not deprivation, it is relief. Fewer obligations mean more focus. Fewer conflicts mean more energy. Fewer expectations mean more authenticity. Men begin to invest in things that offer clear returns, whether that is their skills, their finances, their physical health, or their personal interests. This is not about luxury in the traditional sense. It is about comfort, stability, and control over one's own life. The irony is that men have always played the role of buffering reality, absorbing stress, and providing stability. When they stop doing that, reality becomes sharper for everyone else. This is not because men are punishing anyone. It is because they are no longer shielding others at the expense of themselves. The world feels harsher because the buffer is gone. This is why so many conversations today sound confused and emotionally charged. People are reacting to the effects without acknowledging the causes. Men did not vanish overnight. They were gradually pushed away through messaging, policies, and social dynamics that communicated their disposability. Now that they have listened and adjusted, the absence is being questioned. Men are not asking to be chased, they are not demanding apologies. Most of them are simply moving forward quietly, building lives that feel sustainable and honest. They are choosing environments that reward effort rather than exploit it. They are choosing peace over chaos. And once that peace is found, very few are willing to give it up. This shift is not temporary. It is the result of decades of accumulated experience. Men have learned, adapted, and made decisions accordingly. Whether society acknowledges this or not does not change the trajectory. The pattern is already in motion. And this brings us back to the beginning. When boys are raised to doubt themselves, when their independence is discouraged, and when their emotional development is shaped around control rather than growth, the long term consequences are unavoidable. Those boys grow into men who eventually recognize the pattern and step out of it. The walking away does not begin in adulthood, it begins in childhood, and adulthood is simply where the realization becomes conscious. What often goes unspoken is how long it takes for that realization to fully form. Men do not wake up one morning and decide to disengage from society, relationships, or expectations. It happens slowly, through accumulation. It happens after years of noticing patterns that never change no matter how much effort is applied. It happens after trying to communicate clearly and being told the problem is their tone rather than the content. It happens after being asked to sacrifice again and again while being told that sacrifice is simply the minimum standard. Over time, the cost becomes impossible to ignore. For many men, this awareness begins with a moment of clarity that feels almost unsettling in its simplicity. They notice that no matter how much they give, it is never enough. They notice that boundaries are framed as selfishness, while overextension is treated as duty. They notice that peace is always something postponed until after someone else's needs are met. When this realization clicks, it does not produce rage, it produces fatigue. And fatigue is often the final catalyst for change. Men raised in controlling or emotionally inconsistent households are especially vulnerable to repeating these dynamics in adulthood. They were conditioned early to equate endurance with virtue. They learned that love is something earned through tolerance rather than mutual respect. As adults, they may find themselves in workplaces where effort is rewarded with more responsibility, but not more appreciation. They may enter relationships where emotional labor flows in one direction while being told that asking for reciprocity is unreasonable. These men do not lack empathy. In fact, they often have too much of it. What shifts everything is when men begin to recognize that empathy without boundaries becomes self erasure. They begin to understand that constantly managing other people's emotions is not compassion, it is control disguised as care. Once this distinction becomes clear, the old rules stop making sense. Men start asking questions they were never encouraged to ask before. Why is my worth measured by what I provide rather than who I am? Why is my discomfort dismissed as weakness? Why am I expected to absorb chaos without complaint? These questions are uncomfortable because they disrupt narratives that have been normalized for decades. They challenge the assumption that men exist primarily as utilities rather than individuals. When men stop accepting these assumptions, they naturally step back from environments that rely on them. This is not a coordinated movement. It is a shared response to similar conditions. Independent decisions made by individuals who reach the same conclusion through lived experience. One of the most telling signs of this shift is how men begin to change their relationship with time. Instead of filling every hour with obligations, they become more selective. They stop rushing to meet expectations that were never negotiated. They allow themselves to rest without guilt. This may sound trivial, but for men who were raised to equate rest with laziness, It is revolutionary. Rest becomes a form of resistance against systems that only value output. Financial behavior changes as well. Men who once felt pressure to spend in order to impress or appease begin to reassess their priorities. They focus on saving, investing, and long term stability rather than short term validation. Money becomes a tool for autonomy rather than a symbol of status. This shift often brings a sense of calm that was previously missing. Financial independence reduces vulnerability to manipulation and allows men to make decisions based on reality rather than pressure. Social circles tend to shrink, but what remains becomes more meaningful. Men stop maintaining relationships that are transactional or draining. They gravitate toward people who respect their boundaries and share their values. This can be a lonely transition at first, especially for men who were taught that their role was to accommodate others at all costs. But over time, the quality of connection improves. Silence becomes preferable to noise. Solitude becomes restorative rather than isolating. This evolution often triggers misunderstanding from those who benefited from the old dynamic. When men stop overextending, they may be accused of changing, withdrawing, or becoming indifferent. In reality, they are becoming more present in their own lives. They are redirecting energy inward rather than constantly exporting it. This is not apathy, it is recalibration. It is important to understand that men are not rejecting connection itself. They are rejecting imbalance. They are not opposed to responsibility. They are opposed to responsibility without respect. They are not avoiding contribution. They are avoiding exploitation. This distinction matters, but it is rarely acknowledged because it requires accountability from systems that prefer convenience over fairness. The conversation around masculinity often becomes distorted at this point. Men who assert boundaries are framed as disengaged. Men who prioritize peace are labeled avoidant. Men who refuse to participate in chaos are accused of lacking empathy. These labels serve a purpose. They discourage self examination and shift responsibility away from dysfunctional dynamics. But men who have already walked this path recognize these tactics for what they are: attempts to pull them back into roles they have outgrown. Men who were scapegoated in childhood often experience a profound shift during this phase. For the first time, they begin to separate their identity from other people's projections. They realize that being blamed does not mean being guilty. They understand that constant criticism was never about improvement, it was about control. This realization can be painful because it reframes an entire childhood, but it is also liberating because it removes a burden they never should have carried. Healing for these men does not look like confrontation or validation from those who caused the harm. It looks like disengagement. It looks like choosing environments where their presence is not questioned. It looks like building a life that does not revolve around proving worth. This kind of healing is quiet. It does not seek recognition. It simply moves forward. As more men make these choices, broader societal patterns begin to shift. Participation declines in spaces that once relied on male engagement. Traditional expectations lose their leverage. Systems built on unspoken assumptions struggle to adapt. This is not collapse in the dramatic sense. It is attrition. It is the slow erosion of participation when incentives no longer align with effort. What is often overlooked is how predictable this outcome was. When any group is consistently told they are replaceable, unnecessary, or problematic, they eventually act accordingly. Men listened. They adjusted. They did not protest loudly. They did not demand reform. They simply stepped back. That quiet withdrawal is far more consequential than open resistance because it offers no clear target and no immediate resolution. The response to this withdrawal often reveals more than the withdrawal itself. Calls for men to re engage frequently lack reflection. They emphasize what is missing rather than why it is missing. They appeal to obligation rather than addressing imbalance. They assume men should return to roles that were never renegotiated. But men who have experienced peace are unlikely to return to chaos without meaningful change. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable for many. Meaningful change requires acknowledging past dynamics. It requires recognizing that many men were shaped by environments that prioritize control over development. It requires admitting that telling men they are not needed had consequences. It requires understanding that strength does not mean endless tolerance. Without this acknowledgement, appeals for re engagement will continue to fall flat. Men walking away are not doing so out of spite, they are doing so out of self respect. They are choosing alignment over approval, they are choosing stability over volatility, they are choosing truth over narrative. These choices are deeply personal, but their cumulative effect is undeniable. As men continue to build lives centered on autonomy and peace, they are also redefining success. Success is no longer measured by how much stress one can endure or how many expectations one can satisfy. It is measured by quality of life, mental clarity, and alignment between values and actions. This redefinition challenges long standing assumptions about ambition and worth. For many men, this new definition of success includes simplicity. It includes routines that support health, work that provides stability, and hobbies that bring genuine enjoyment. It includes freedom from constant evaluation. This simplicity is often mistaken for lack of ambition, but it is more accurately described as intentional living. Men are choosing depth over breadth, focus over frenzy. This shift also influences how men view relationships. Rather than seeking validation or completion, they approach connection with discernment. They look for reciprocity, respect, and emotional maturity. They are less willing to tolerate games or inconsistency. This does not mean they expect perfection. It means they expect honesty. Relationships become choices rather than obligations. The men who thrive in this phase are those who learn to trust their observations. They stop gaslighting themselves. They stop dismissing patterns that consistently produce the same outcomes. They stop overriding their instincts to maintain harmony. This trust in observable reality becomes their compass. It guides decisions large and small. It reinforces confidence that was eroded early in life. What emerges from this process is not bitterness, but groundedness. Men become more self contained. They rely less on external validation. They develop a quiet confidence that does not need to announce itself. This confidence is often misunderstood because it does not seek dominance or approval. It simply exists. As this way of being becomes more common, it challenges cultural narratives that rely on male overextension. It exposes the fragility of systems built on unreciprocated effort. It highlights the importance of mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. These challenges are uncomfortable, but they are necessary for any sustainable future. The reality is that men have always adapted to circumstances. They have adjusted roles, expectations, and strategies throughout history. What we are seeing now is another adaptation. It is a response to conditions that no longer support their well being. Ignoring this response will not reverse it. Understanding it might. And men are not disappearing, they are repositioning, they are choosing where and how to invest themselves. They are conserving energy for what truly matters. This is not the end of contribution, it is the end of unquestioned contribution. As men continue down this path, something else begins to surface that many were never taught to recognize, which is grief. Not grief in the dramatic sense, but a quiet reckoning with what could have been. Men begin to realize that much of their early life was spent adapting rather than becoming. They grieve the versions of themselves that were suppressed to maintain peace, the instincts they were taught to distrust, and the confidence that was chipped away through years of subtle invalidation. This grief is not about blaming the past endlessly. It is about finally seeing it clearly. For men raised in environments where control was normalized, clarity can feel destabilizing at first. When you have spent years navigating contradictions, calm can feel unfamiliar. Many men initially mistake peace for emptiness. They are so accustomed to tension that stillness feels wrong. But over time, the nervous system recalibrates. The absence of constant emotional pressure reveals space to think, to reflect, and to choose deliberately rather than reactively. This is where genuine self discovery begins. One of the most significant changes during this phase is how men relate to authority. Men who were conditioned to submit emotionally often learn to question respectfully but firmly. They stop assuming that authority figures are inherently right. They evaluate based on consistency and outcome rather than position or tone. This shift affects everything from workplace decisions to social engagement. Men become less impressed by titles and more attentive to behavior. They stop confusing confidence with competence. This recalibration also extends inward. Men begin to develop an internal standard that replaces external approval. Instead of asking whether they are liked, they ask whether they are aligned. Instead of asking whether they are accepted, they ask whether they are respected. This internal compass becomes increasingly reliable because it is built on lived experience rather than abstract expectations. Over time, men learn to trust it without apology. Another quiet but profound change is how men experience responsibility. Responsibility no longer feels like a burden imposed by others, it becomes a choice. Men take ownership of what they genuinely value and release responsibility for outcomes they cannot control. This distinction is crucial. It prevents burnout, it preserves energy, it allows men to be effective where it matters rather than depleted everywhere. Men who reach this stage often find that their tolerance for chaos drops significantly. This is not because they become fragile, but because they recognize the cost of prolonged disorder. Chaos consumes time, energy, and focus. Men who value peace begin to avoid environments where chaos is normalized or rewarded. This can include certain social settings, work cultures, or relational dynamics. The decision to disengage is not dramatic, it is practical. As these men simplify their lives, they often discover that contentment is less about accumulation and more about consistency. Regular routines, predictable effort, and incremental progress replace constant striving. This steadiness creates resilience. When challenges arise, they are addressed without emotional overreaction. Men learn that not every problem requires immediate resolution. Some require patience, others require distance. Discernment replaces urgency. This shift in pacing also changes how men communicate. They become more direct, not out of aggression, but out of respect for their own time. They say less, but what they say carries weight. They stop over explaining. They stop defending boundaries that were clearly stated. Silence becomes a tool rather than a weakness. This often unsettles people who are accustomed to negotiating or testing limits, but men who have found clarity no longer feel compelled to engage in endless discussion. The cumulative effect of these changes is a man who is difficult to manipulate, not because he is guarded or cynical, but because he understands patterns. He recognizes emotional hooks and declines to bite. He distinguishes between genuine concern and pressure disguised as care. This awareness is not paranoia, it is literacy. Emotional literacy developed through experience rather than theory. For men who were scapegoated, this stage can feel like stepping into adulthood for the first time. They realized that they were never inherently flawed. They were placed in roles that required them to absorb dysfunction. Once they step out of those roles, their competence and stability become evident. This realization can be both empowering and painful because it highlights how unnecessary much of the suffering was. It is important to note that walking away does not mean men stop contributing altogether. It means they become selective about where and how they contribute. They invest in environments that reward integrity and effort. They withdraw from spaces that rely on guilt or obligation. This selectivity leads to higher quality contribution, even if it is less visible. Men focus on building rather than appeasing. As more men adopt this approach, cultural friction increases. Systems built on assumptions of endless male availability begin to strain. Expectations that were never explicitly negotiated become harder to enforce. This friction is often misinterpreted as a crisis of masculinity. In reality, it is a crisis of outdated expectations. Masculinity itself is not disappearing, it is recalibrating. This recalibration is quieter than previous cultural shifts because it does not rely on slogans or movements. It relies on individual decisions made privately. Men do not need permission to disengage from what harms them. They simply do it. This makes the shift harder to counter because it is decentralized and grounded in personal experience rather than ideology. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this transition is the role of accountability. Men who walk away are often accused of avoiding responsibility. In truth, they are practicing a more precise form of accountability. They hold themselves accountable for their choices, their effort, and their values. They refuse accountability for outcomes driven by systems or dynamics beyond their control. This distinction is uncomfortable for those who benefited from blurred boundaries. As men continue to choose autonomy, they also redefine loyalty. Loyalty is no longer unconditional endurance, it is mutual respect sustained over time. Men are loyal to principles rather than roles. They stay where trust is present and leave where it is absent. This approach reduces drama and increases stability. It also challenges narratives that equate loyalty with self sacrifice. Another noticeable change is how men engage with conflict. Rather than escalating or absorbing it, they assess whether engagement is worthwhile. Some conflicts are addressed directly, others are bypassed entirely. Men learn that not every battle deserves their energy. This discernment preserves mental health and reinforces self respect. Walking away from unnecessary conflict is not avoidance, it is strategy. This strategic disengagement extends to social discourse as well. Men become less reactive to provocation. They stop trying to correct every misunderstanding. They recognize that some conversations are designed to extract energy rather than exchange ideas. By opting out, they deny those conversations their power. Silence becomes a form of self governance. As this mindset solidifies, men often experience a sense of grounded confidence that feels different from performative confidence. It does not rely on dominance or validation. It is rooted in self knowledge. This confidence is stable because it is not contingent on external approval. It allows men to navigate uncertainty without panic. It fosters resilience rather than rigidity. The long term impact of this shift is still unfolding, but certain trends are already visible. Men are delaying or declining participation in traditional milestones that no longer align with their values. They are prioritizing flexibility over status. They are investing in skills rather than appearances. These choices reflect a pragmatic assessment of risk and reward rather than emotional reaction. Critics often frame these trends as disengagement from society. A more accurate description is selective engagement. Men are not withdrawing from life, they are choosing life on terms that do not require constant self negation. This distinction matters because it reframes the narrative from loss to evolution. At its core, this entire process is about self ownership. Men are reclaiming authority over their time, energy, and identity. They are no longer outsourcing their worth to systems that cannot provide it. This reclamation is quiet but transformative. It alters how men relate to themselves and to the world. As men continue to walk this path, they become examples rather than advocates. They do not need to persuade others. Their lives speak for themselves. Stability, clarity, and peace become visible markers of success. These markers challenge assumptions about fulfillment and force a reevaluation of what truly matters. This is not a rejection of connection, contribution, or community. It is a rejection of dynamics that require men to disappear in order to belong. Men are choosing to exist fully, even if that means existing differently than expected. The walking away is not an end, it is a beginning. It is the point where men stop living reactively and start living intentionally. It is the moment when survival strategies are replaced with chosen values. And once that transition is made, there is no incentive to return to the old way of being. At this stage in the journey, men begin to notice something subtle but deeply important about their internal world, which is that their thoughts become quieter, not empty, not dull, but ordered. When a man is no longer constantly bracing for criticism, conflict, or emotional volatility, his mind no longer needs to stay on high alert. The mental noise that once consumed his attention gradually fades. This creates space for long term thinking, planning, and reflection. It is in this space that men begin to understand how much of their previous mental energy was spent managing instability rather than building a future. This clarity often leads men to reevaluate narratives they once accepted without question. They begin to revisit ideas about duty, success, and purpose with a more critical eye. They ask themselves whether the paths they were encouraged to follow actually served them, or whether those paths primarily served institutions and expectations that offered little in return. This questioning is not rebellious, it is rational. It reflects a mature reassessment based on lived experience rather than inherited belief. One of the most profound realizations men reach is that many of the struggles they internalized were never personal failures. They were structural mismatches. Men were often placed in roles that demanded sacrifice without sustainability. When those roles inevitably led to exhaustion or dissatisfaction, the individual was blamed rather than the structure. Walking away allows men to see this clearly. It removes the fog of constant responsibility and reveals the architecture beneath it. This realization changes how men approach self improvement. Instead of endlessly fixing perceived flaws, they focus on removing themselves from environments that create those flaws. They recognize that a healthy individual in an unhealthy system will still struggle. Improvement becomes less about self correction and more about self placement. Where you stand matters as much as who you are. Men who reach this understanding also become more patient with themselves. They stop rushing to prove progress. They accept that growth is uneven and nonlinear. This patience contrasts sharply with the urgency they once felt to meet external milestones. Without constant comparison, men progress at a pace that feels natural rather than forced. This steadiness reduces anxiety and increases consistency. Another shift occurs in how men experience validation. External praise loses its grip. Compliments are appreciated but not required. Criticism is evaluated rather than absorbed. Men learn to differentiate between feedback that is useful and feedback that is merely expressive. This discernment protects self esteem without closing off learning. It is a balanced posture that many men were never encouraged to adopt earlier in life. As men stabilize internally, their external behavior often becomes more restrained and deliberate. They speak less impulsively. They react less defensively. They choose their words carefully because they no longer feel the need to constantly assert or justify themselves. This composure can be misinterpreted as detachment, but it is actually presence. Men are fully there, just no longer performing. This composure also affects how men handle disappointment. Instead of spiraling or self blaming, they analyze outcomes objectively. They ask what was within their control and what was not. They adjust accordingly. This pragmatic approach reduces emotional volatility and fosters resilience. Setbacks become data rather than verdicts. For men who were conditioned to equate worth with usefulness, this phase requires relearning how to value themselves without constant output. This is not easy. Many men feel an initial sense of guilt when they are not actively producing or providing. Over time, they learn that rest and reflection are not indulgences, they are maintenance. Just as physical systems require downtime to function optimally, so do psychological systems. This understanding often leads men to prioritize health in ways they previously neglected. Sleep, nutrition, and physical activity become non negotiable foundations rather than optional extras. Men recognize that sustained clarity depends on physical stability. Caring for the body becomes an act of self respect rather than vanity. This shift has cascading effects on mood, energy, and confidence. And as men regain control over their internal and external lives, they also become more aware of how scarcity shaped their past decisions. Scarcity of approval, scarcity of peace, scarcity of respect. These scarcities drove behaviors that no longer make sense in a more stable context. Men begin to let go of habits formed under pressure. They stop overcommitting. They stop chasing diminishing returns. They stop negotiating their boundaries. This release of scarcity thinking allows men to approach opportunities with discernment rather than desperation. They evaluate offers based on alignment rather than fear of missing out. This applies to work, relationships, and social engagement. Men choose what fits rather than what flatters. This selectivity increases satisfaction and reduces regret. Another important development is how men reinterpret independence. Independence is no longer isolation, it is self sufficiency paired with selective connection. Men learn that needing nothing does not mean wanting nothing. They can value companionship without relying on it for identity or stability. This balanced independence is deeply grounding. It allows men to engage from a place of choice rather than need. This mindset also reshapes how men view conflict resolution. They no longer seek to win arguments, they seek clarity. If clarity cannot be achieved, disengagement becomes an acceptable outcome. This approach conserves energy and avoids cycles of unproductive debate. Men learn that not every disagreement requires resolution. Some simply require distance. As this pattern continues, men develop a strong sense of internal coherence. Their actions align with their values. Their words align with their boundaries. This coherence reduces internal friction and builds confidence organically. Men feel less divided within themselves. They are no longer torn between who they are and who they are expected to be. The ripple effects of this internal coherence extend outward. Men become more reliable because they are no longer overextended. They keep commitments because they make fewer of them. They show up consistently rather than sporadically. This reliability is rooted in honesty rather than obligation. It strengthens trust where it exists and exposes fragility where it does not. This phase also brings a reevaluation of legacy. Men begin to think beyond immediate outcomes and consider long term impact. They ask what kind of life they are building and what kind of example they are setting, even if no one is watching. Legacy becomes less about public recognition and more about private integrity. This quiet sense of purpose replaces external ambition. And for some men, this leads to mentorship roles, though not in traditional forms. They share insights through example rather than instruction. They offer perspective when asked rather than imposed. This low pressure guidance is often more effective because it respects autonomy. Men who have reclaimed their own agency are careful not to undermine it in others. As more men try and embody this way of living, the contrast with older models becomes stark. The frantic pursuit of validation, the constant performance, the willingness to endure dysfunction for approval, all begin to look unsustainable. Men who have stepped away from these patterns see them clearly and choose not to re enter. This clarity creates a quiet divide between those who continue to chase and those who have opted out. It is important to understand that opting out does not mean opting out of responsibility to oneself. In fact, responsibility deepens. Men become more accountable to their own standards. They cannot hide behind expectations or roles. Their choices are deliberate and owned. This level of accountability is demanding, but it is also empowering. It places control where it belongs. This control also changes how men interpret freedom. Freedom is no longer the absence of constraint, it is the presence of alignment. Men feel free when their actions reflect their values and their environment supports their well being. This redefinition shifts priorities and reduces impulsive behavior. Freedom becomes sustainable rather than fleeting. As men continue to walk this path, they often encounter moments of doubt. Old narratives resurface. Questions arise about whether disengagement is selfish or whether peace is earned. These moments are natural. Conditioning does not disappear overnight. But each time a man chooses alignment over appeasement, the new pattern strengthens. Confidence becomes cumulative. Over time, men notice that life feels more predictable, not because it lacks challenges, but because responses are consistent. They trust themselves to handle whatever arises. This trust reduces fear and increases adaptability. Men become less reactive to uncertainty because they know they are capable of navigating it. This capability also changes how men view society at large. They become observers rather than participants in certain dynamics. They watch trends unfold without feeling compelled to react. They recognize cycles repeating. This observational stance provides perspective and reduces emotional entanglement. Men engage where it makes sense and disengage where it does not. At this point, walking away is no longer an active decision, it is simply the default state. Men are not constantly evaluating whether to re enter old patterns, they have moved beyond them. The distance provides clarity, the clarity reinforces the distance. What remains is a life that feels internally consistent and externally manageable. Men wake up without dread. They move through their days with intention. They rest without guilt. They build without desperation. This is not perfection, it is sustainability. This sustainability is the true outcome of walking away. It is not isolation, it is balance, it is not rejection, it is selection. Men are choosing lives that do not require them to abandon themselves to belong. And once a man experiences this level of internal peace and external coherence, the appeal of returning to constant negotiation and self sacrifice fades completely. The old patterns lose their power because they no longer align with reality. As men settle fully into this new orientation toward life, another transformation takes place that is rarely acknowledged, which is the reshaping of identity itself. Identity, for many men, was once built around external roles: provider, fixer, protector, problem solver, absorber of stress. These roles were not inherently negative, but they became constrictive when they were treated as obligations rather than choices. Walking away allows men to disentangle who they are from what they do for others. This disentanglement is not instant. It unfolds gradually as men experience life without constant role enforcement. When identity is no longer anchored to approval or output, men begin to experience themselves more directly. They notice preferences they never allowed themselves to have. They acknowledge limits they previously ignored. They recognize strengths that were never celebrated because they did not serve immediate utility. This process can feel disorienting at first because it removes familiar reference points. But over time, it leads to a more integrated sense of self. Men become whole rather than functional. And this wholeness changes how men respond to pressure. External demands no longer automatically override internal signals. When something feels wrong, men pause instead of pushing through. They evaluate rather than comply. This pause is powerful because it interrupts cycles that once ran unchecked. It creates space for choice. Choice restores agency. Agency restores dignity. One of the most important outcomes of this agency is discernment around sacrifice. Men begin to differentiate between sacrifice that builds something meaningful and sacrifice that simply sustains imbalance. They become willing to endure hardship for goals they believe in, but unwilling to endure it for validation that never arrives. This distinction prevents resentment. It also prevents burnout. Sacrifice becomes intentional rather than habitual. As men refine this discernment, they often reflect on how early conditioning normalized overgiving. Many were praised for endurance rather than wisdom. They were rewarded for silence rather than clarity. Walking away forces a reevaluation of these values. Men realize that endurance without purpose is not strength. Silence without consent is not peace. True strength lies in knowing when to persist and when to withdraw. This insight profoundly affects how men approach obligation. Obligations are no longer assumed, they are negotiated internally. Men ask whether an obligation aligns with their values, capacity, and long term goals. If it does not, they decline without guilt. This is a radical shift for men who were taught that saying no was selfish or weak. Over time, declining misaligned obligations becomes an act of self respect rather than defiance. And as men practice this self respect consistently, they often notice that some relationships fade naturally. These relationships were sustained by imbalance rather than mutuality. Their disappearance is not a loss so much as a revelation. Men see clearly which connections were genuine and which were transactional. This clarity can be sobering, but it is also freeing. It reduces emotional clutter and creates space for authentic connection. In parallel, men often experience a recalibration of ambition. Ambition becomes less about comparison and more about craftsmanship. Men focus on doing things well rather than doing things visibly. They invest in mastery rather than exposure. This shift leads to deeper satisfaction because progress is measured internally rather than socially. Men take pride in competence rather than recognition. This craftsmanship mindset extends beyond work into all areas of life. Men approach health, hobbies, and personal projects with patience and curiosity. They enjoy the process rather than chasing outcomes. This enjoyment is subtle but sustaining. It contrasts sharply with the anxiety driven pursuit of approval that once dominated their efforts. As men settle into this rhythm, their tolerance for manipulation decreases even further. Emotional appeals that once triggered guilt now trigger analysis. Men ask what is being asked of them and why. They assess whether the request respects their autonomy. If it does not, they disengage calmly. This calm disengagement is often misunderstood because it lacks drama, but it is precisely this lack of drama that makes it effective. This effectiveness reshapes how men view power. Power is no longer about influence over others, it is about sovereignty over oneself. Men recognize that the ability to walk away is one of the most underappreciated forms of power. It removes leverage from dynamics that rely on dependence. It restores balance without confrontation. As this understanding deepens, men often stop participating in performative conflict altogether. They no longer feel the need to announce their positions or defend their choices publicly. Their lives become their statements. This quiet confidence frustrates those who seek reaction, but it also commands respect from those who recognize authenticity. Over time, men notice that their emotional range becomes more stable. High highs and low lows flatten into a steady baseline. This is not numbness, it is regulation. Men experience joy without excess and disappointment without collapse. This emotional steadiness supports clear thinking and long term planning. It also makes men less susceptible to emotional contagion. This regulation is especially significant for men who grew up in volatile environments. For them, emotional steadiness represents safety. It allows the nervous system to finally relax. This relaxation unlocks creativity, curiosity, and strategic thinking that were previously suppressed by constant vigilance. Men begin to think expansively rather than defensively. As men think more expansively, they also reassess what they owe the world. Many realize that they were socialized to believe their worth was tied to constant contribution. Walking away reframes this belief. Men understand that contribution is meaningful only when it is chosen freely. Forced contribution breeds resentment and inefficiency. Chosen contribution fosters excellence. This realization leads men to invest selectively in causes, communities, and projects that align with their values. They contribute deeply rather than broadly. This depth creates impact that is often invisible to metrics but significant in substance. Men measure success by outcomes rather than applause. As more men adopt this approach, it becomes increasingly difficult to shame them back into old roles. Shame loses its power when internal standards are strong. Men no longer accept guilt for refusing to participate in dynamics that undermine them. This resistance is quiet but resolute. It does not argue, it simply opts out. The opt out is often mischaracterized as disengagement from responsibility. In reality, it represents a more refined sense of responsibility. Men take responsibility for their own lives first. From that foundation, they contribute where it makes sense. This sequence matters. Contribution built on self abandonment is unsustainable. Contribution built on self respect endures. As men continue to live this way, they often attract curiosity rather than criticism. Others notice the stability, the calm, the absence of reactivity. They ask questions, they seek insight. Men share when invited, they do not preach. This organic influence is more powerful than advocacy because it is grounded in lived reality. This influence extends subtly into cultural perception. The image of masculinity begins to shift away from relentless endurance toward deliberate engagement. Men model a form of strength that includes restraint, discernment, and self governance. This model challenges extremes without opposing them directly. It simply exists as an alternative. At this stage, walking away is fully integrated. It is no longer an identity or a stance, it is a background condition. Men live without constant negotiation of their worth. They move through life with a sense of internal permission that was previously absent. This permission allows them to explore, build, and rest without justification. The long arc of this transformation reveals something important. Men did not walk away because they stopped caring. They walked away because they started caring about themselves. This care does not make them less capable. It makes them more effective. It does not isolate them. It clarifies connection. As men continue forward, they carry with them the lessons of their past without being defined by them. They understand how conditioning shaped them, but they are no longer bound by it. This understanding provides resilience against future pressures. When old patterns attempt to reassert themselves, men recognize them quickly and respond accordingly. This responsiveness creates a life that feels coherent rather than chaotic. Decisions align with values, effort aligns with reward, energy aligns with purpose. This alignment is the quiet success that walking away makes possible. And once alignment becomes the standard, returning to misalignment feels unnatural. Men no longer need to remind themselves why they left old dynamics behind. The contrast is sufficient, the peace is sufficient. As this journey reaches its final phase, what becomes most visible is not what men have rejected, but what they have built in its place. Walking away was never meant to be an end state, it was a clearing, a necessary removal of noise, distortion, and obligation that made space for something more stable to emerge. What emerges is not rebellion, not withdrawal, but a grounded way of living that is internally consistent and externally sustainable. Men are no longer living in reaction, they are living in alignment. Alignment changes everything. It changes how men wake up in the morning, how they approach their work, how they structure their days, and how they engage with the world. There is no longer a constant sense of urgency driven by the fear of falling behind or being judged. Instead, there is a measured pace, a deliberate rhythm. Men move through life with intention rather than compulsion. This does not make life effortless, but it makes it honest. Challenges still exist, but they are faced without the added burden of self betrayal. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is how men relate to uncertainty. Where uncertainty once triggered anxiety and overcompensation, it now invites assessment. Men who trust themselves do not panic when outcomes are unclear. They gather information, consider options, and choose a direction without rushing. This capacity to remain steady in uncertainty is a form of strength that is rarely celebrated but deeply valuable. It allows men to adapt without losing themselves. As men continue to live this way, they begin to understand something essential about peace. And peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the absence of unnecessary conflict. It is knowing which battles are worth engaging and which are not. Men who have walked away from chaos recognize that constant friction is not proof of engagement or passion. It is often a sign of misalignment. Peace becomes the metric by which decisions are evaluated. This clarity also changes how men experience success. Success is no longer something that needs to be displayed or defended. It is felt internally. It shows up as stability, predictability, and self trust. Men measure success by how little their lives are disrupted by external turbulence. They value systems that support longevity rather than intensity. This long view allows men to build lives that endure rather than burn out. Another outcome of this long view is patience. Men become patient with processes, with people, and with themselves. They understand that meaningful growth takes time and cannot be forced. This patience reduces frustration and increases resilience. Men stop expecting immediate results from efforts that require consistency. They commit without clinging to timelines. This shift reduces stress and improves outcomes. As patience grows, so does humility. Men recognize that they do not need to have all the answers. They are comfortable admitting uncertainty without feeling diminished. This humility fosters learning. Men remain open to new information without surrendering their core values. They adjust when evidence warrants it. This flexibility is not weakness, it is intelligence applied over time. This combination of patience, humility, and self trust creates a stable foundation for decision making. Men no longer outsource their judgment, they weigh input carefully and decide deliberately. This autonomy reduces susceptibility to influence and manipulation. Men are not easily swayed by emotional appeals or social pressure. They respond to substance rather than spectacle. As this autonomy solidifies, Men also redefine what contribution means to them. Contribution is no longer about filling gaps left by others. It is about creating value where they are uniquely positioned to do so. Men invest their effort where it has impact and meaning. They decline roles that drain them without purpose. This selectivity enhances the quality of their contribution and preserves their energy. This preservation of energy is not hoarding, it is stewardship. Men understand that energy is finite and must be allocated wisely. They stop wasting it on endless debate, justification, or appeasement. They use it to build, to maintain, and to refine their lives. This disciplined use of energy is one of the most important lessons walking away teaches. Over time, men notice that their lives feel lighter, not because responsibilities have disappeared, but because unnecessary weight has been removed. Obligations that once felt compulsory are now optional. Expectations that once felt binding are now negotiable. Men operate from consent rather than coercion. This shift transforms how responsibility feels. It becomes purposeful rather than burdensome. This purposeful responsibility also changes how men relate to others. Relationships are no longer arenas for proving worth, they are spaces for mutual exchange. Men show up honestly and expect honesty in return. When that expectation is not met, they disengage without resentment. They do not linger in dynamics that require them to shrink or perform. This clarity simplifies social life and reduces emotional exhaustion. As men continue to live this way, they often become more present. Presence replaces vigilance. They listen without scanning for threat. They speak without anticipating backlash. This presence improves communication and deepens connection where it exists. It also reveals where connection is not possible. Men accept this without forcing outcomes. This acceptance extends to society as a whole. Men no longer feel compelled to fix systemic issues at the expense of their own well being. They recognize that some problems cannot be solved by individual sacrifice. They contribute where they can and step back where they cannot. This balanced engagement prevents despair and preserves hope grounded in realism. What emerges from all of this is a man who is self governed. He does not need constant affirmation or approval. He is guided by internal standards shaped by experience, reflection, and observation. He knows what he will tolerate and what he will not. He understands that walking away is not failure, it is discernment applied at scale. This discernment also protects men from cycles of guilt. Guilt loses its power when it is examined rather than accepted reflexively. Men ask whether guilt is warranted or imposed. If it is warranted, they address it. If it is imposed, they release it. This distinction is liberating. It allows men to act ethically without being controlled emotionally. As this ethical clarity deepens, men find that their values stabilize. They do not shift with trends or pressure. They are tested by reality and refined by experience. This stability provides a sense of direction that was previously missing. Men move forward without needing constant reassurance. They trust the path because they chose it consciously. The cumulative effect of these changes is a life that feels coherent, past, present, and future align. Men integrate their experiences rather than compartmentalize them. They understand where they came from, why they changed, and where they are going. This integration reduces internal conflict and strengthens identity. Men no longer feel divided between expectation and authenticity. This integrated identity is resilient. It withstands criticism, uncertainty, and change. Men do not crumble when challenged because their foundation is internal. They adjust without losing themselves. They adapt without surrendering values. This resilience is quiet but formidable. As men embody this resilience, they become examples rather than explanations. They do not need to justify their choices. Their lives demonstrate the outcomes of alignment. Stability, clarity, and peace become visible markers. These markers invite reflection in others without demanding agreement. It is important to understand that this is not a rejection of society or community, it is a recalibration of engagement. Men are choosing how and where they belong. They are not withdrawing from life, they are entering it on terms that honor their humanity. This recalibration will continue to shape the future in ways that are still unfolding. But one thing is clear: men who have learned to walk away from what harms them are unlikely to return to it willingly. The cost is too high. The peace is too valuable. As we reach the end of this discussion, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed today? Do you agree with the ideas explored here? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and your perspective, because these conversations matter and they shape how we understand the world around us. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.